for that. Acts chapter 2, we want to run through these, just a couple of scriptures real quick as you prepare your tithes and offerings and your gifts. And I want to talk to you just something that stuck out to me this week in my time of prayer, and I'll pass it on to you because if you're a Word fan like I am, this should bless you. Acts chapter 2, verse 44. Excuse me. Well, we'll look at verse 42. It says, Acts 2:42, it says, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and they continued in fellowship, they continued in breaking bread. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles." Verse 44, "And all they that believed were together, and they had all things common. And they sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men as every man had need. And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and in breaking bread from house to house, they did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. They spent their time praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved." Now, we're talking about giving, and I want to zero in on verse 44 and 45. In the Amplified, it says this, "And all who believed," on your screens here, it says, "And all who believed, who adhered to and trusted in," they should have it on your screens, we had it last service, there it is, "and all who believed, who adhered to and trusted in and relied on Jesus were united, and they were together, and they had everything in common. And they sold their possessions." What does that mean? Their landed property, their real estate, and their movable goods. "And they distributed the price among them all, according as they had need." So that's Acts chapter 2, the start of the church. Go to Acts chapter 4, and let's look at this in Acts chapter 4. And we'll see this idea continue. Verse 32. It says, Acts chapter 4, verse 32, "And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them," in other words, everybody agreed, "neither said any of them that aught, or that any of the things which they possessed was his own." They didn't say anything was theirs, but they had all things common. In other words, they put everything in a common pot. Verse 33, "And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands and houses sold them, brought the prices of the things that were sold, laid them down at the apostles' feet, and then distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. And Joseph, who by the apostles was surnamed Barnabas, which is being interpreted the son of consolation or the son of encouragement, he was a Levite of the country of Cyprus. He had land, he sold it, and he brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet." So again, in the early church, the startup of it, it was all hands on deck. Everybody sell what you have, put it in the middle, and we'll get this thing financed and get it started. They needed all hands on deck. But go with me now to 1 Corinthians 16. Some of this is 3 scriptures just for the offering. Yeah, it's all right. It's Father's Day. If it was 3 pieces of pie, you wouldn't be complaining. 3 pieces of pie? If I gave you 3 pieces of pie, you'd be like, "Hey, it's Father's Day." Well, I'm doing the same thing with the scripture. 1 Corinthians 16. Back off me, it's Father's Day. So, something shifts, which is we don't give in the New Testament like they gave in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4. That is not how we're supposed to give today. A lot of people say, we got to go back to the early church, man. We got to sell everything and just put it in the middle, and man, we'll move on a commune and make love, not war, man. It'll be great. And that's how they did it when they started up. But that's not how we do it now. As a matter of fact, I was thinking this morning when this church started a number of years ago, almost 12 years ago, when this church started, that's how we did it. The founders, there were a few families that started with us, and we had all things common. Some people moved in together. Everybody shared and shared alike. It was like some people left their jobs. Some people kept working so that the money they could make could come into the church to help get chairs and microphones and everything like that. And man, when somebody would get money, we'd say, "Okay, how are you doing on your lights?" Or "How are you doing here?" Or, "I got $20, I'll feed you today." And somebody else, "I got $20, I'll feed you tomorrow." And that's how everybody lived. But it didn't stay like that. In other words, as the church grew, that type of communal type, everything in the one pot and make it. It didn't continue like that because it's not necessary. So Paul now, 1 Corinthians 16, they graduate from that. And watch how Paul, years later, talks about offerings. Verse 1, "Now concerning the collection..." Oh, you know what? I was supposed to look at that Acts 4 in the Amplified. I apologize. Media, if you have those just the verses we did last service. I don't know if you still have them. I know I've jumped the track here, but that Acts 4, I'm so sorry. I thought this was interesting. Yeah, nor was there any that are destitute or needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses, here it is, proceeded to sell them. And one by one, they brought and gave back the amount received from the sales. I like that. So if you had a house, or if you had a condo, if you had an extra trailer, if you had it wasn't even extra, they were just selling stuff, then they brought the money. Now, 1 Corinthians 16, okay. Verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the church of Galatia, he says, I want you to do the same thing I told them. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay something in store, as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. Now this is a totally different model. Acts chapter 2 and chapter 4 was, everybody find whatever we have, put it in a pot, and we'll all live. If we have a need, we'll just take care of it out of that. All hands on deck. Everybody sell what you have and put it in a pot, and we'll do the church off of it. 1 Corinthians says, look, upon the first day of the week, which is Sunday, or once a week, as God's brought stuff in your house, set aside a portion to do something with for the work of the ministry. Notice the difference. They put everything in a pot and had all things common. Over here, we just take as God prospers us, and as God brings in our house, we take a little piece and set it aside for the purpose of giving. That's the difference. There was all in one pot, and they operated out of one pot. We are not that way. We are like 1 Corinthians 16. We get it and set aside each week as God prospers us. Now, the difference between the two is when the church first started, everybody put in a pile, and it was like you emptied out. As a matter of fact, the only people that got in trouble in the early church were the people that played around with his offering. You remember there's a husband and wife couple in the church, and they pretended that they were doing it, but they really weren't. They showed up at church, and Barnabas said, hey man, I sold my land, here's the money. And this guy said, I sold my land, here's the money. This guy said, and then this couple comes along and says, we sold our land, here's the money, but it wasn't the money. They were holding back some of the money. And Peter said, well, you don't have to give the money. It's your money. If you don't want to give it, don't give it. But don't pretend like you're giving it when you're not. And so anyway, but what about us? We don't do that. As we get paid, some of us get paid once a week, some of us gets paid bi-weekly, some of us gets paid once a month or whatever it is. As God prospers us, we set aside and we bring our offering, but we don't all sell all our clothes and all our shoes and all our TVs and bring it down, because we're not in that stage of the church, and neither were they. So that's what's changed. Theirs was an all-in, and we'll break it up as people have need. This was as God prospers you. That's what changed. What hasn't changed is that everybody participated in both systems. Back here it said in Acts chapter 2 and chapter 4, they all had all things in common. They all sold what they had. They all brought the price of it. They all laid it down, and they all gave distribution. What does it say in 1 Corinthians 16? It says in verse 2, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you set by him in store as God has prospered him. Notice how we give. They gave all. We only give a little bit week by week. But notice what didn't change. Everybody participates. I think I lost some of you. Let me try it again. I'm going to try it in a different language. Start again. Ông chị nói bảo chị đừng bảo cả. Ông chị nói bảo là Acts chapter 2, bảo chị nói bảo Acts chapter 4. Bông chị nói bảo chị nói bộ chị nói bộ cái mèo chị nói bảo bộ chị nào. So in Acts chapter 2, y'all looking like you didn't know what I was talking about. In Acts chapter 2, what was it? The giving, what did they give? Everything. Who did everything? Everybody. In our world, we don't give everything, but who gives each week as God provides? Everybody. And that's what I've noticed in churches is we go around and we sit in church and we're like, yeah, man, I really hope they do this. And that's not how it worked. We don't all throw everything in. We're not selling our stuff. We don't do that anymore. But as God brings in, some people God's going to bring in, millions of dollars a year in our church, and they give out of their stuff. And some people make $10,000, $12,000, $20,000, and they give out of there. But the difference is not, well, this guy, the multimillionaire businessman, he didn't have to sell his house and sell his yacht. If it was Acts chapter 2, he'd have to sell his house in South Florida. He'd have to sell his yacht. He'd have to sell everything and put it all in. That's Acts chapter 2. But we're not under that. So he gets to keep his house, but every time as God brings stuff to him, he's got to bring to the church. And the person here who's $20,000 a year, they'd have to get rid of their condo, and they'd have to do this, put it in. That's if we were Acts chapter 2, but we're not. But as that $20,000 person a year person gets stuff, they got to bring some together. And as the multi-million-dollar a year person gets some, they bring some together. But guess what? Everybody participated there, and everybody participates here. But now we have this kind of idea that the multi-million-dollar guy looks at it and says, well, I really hope they got it covered. That's not doing their part. And the person, $20,000 a year, says, well, I don't really have anything. I hope some of these rich people are covered. That's not doing their part. It's all of us in it together. Now, by show of hands, and I know we have many online and out in overflow that I can't see, but by show of hands, wherever you are, if you consider this to be your church, like if you say, they say, where is your church? You consider, raise your hand. Anybody just say, okay, so, okay, you put your hand down. And that's members, visitors, serial visitors, you hear all the time, but you hadn't joined or whatever. When people say, oh, you want to come to my church? Say, I already got a church. If you would say, this is your church, what am I saying is, every one of those hands that went up should take upon them the fellowship of 1 Corinthians 16. Why? What does he say in verse 2? Let every one of you lay aside. So we're the what that we give is different, but the unification of participation is the same. We're still one church. If we were in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4 church, we all would empty out everything and put it in a pile. But we're not that church. We're a 1 Corinthians 16 church. As God prospers us and takes care of us, every one of us sets something aside. And so if we're taking up an offering for missions, every one of us. If we're taking up an offering for, a new youth facility, every one of us. If we're taking up an offering, or just in general, every one of us. And somebody said, well, I only get paid every 2 weeks. I know it may not be every week for you, but when I say everyone, I mean us, the pastors, the elders, the ministers, the leadership, all the way down to the people that just joined last week. As a matter of fact, when I teach new members, that's one of the things I teach, that when God called you here, He called you here to participate. And participate is not just show up and get the message. What? You're now in the group of the 1 Corinthians 16 too. You're now one of the every one of us. And what do? Every time we set aside. Now, God does not expect you to give. The multimillionaire businessman just closed a deal. He made $800,000. He's writing out 80 grand today, and he's going to put another 20 with it, and offering or whatever, and say, here you go. So, Pastor, I can't do that, man. I'm not expecting you to do that, but I am expecting you to do your part. I don't know what your part is. Your part may be $3, $5, $10, $12. I don't know what your part is, but that's the fellowship. The fellowship is we're one church body, and we don't observe other people participate. We're just as unified as the early church. We may not give how they give, but we're just as much one as they were. We all give as God brings into our hands. Everybody understand what I'm talking about?